wanted to bring something in here which can be a real issue depending on what your compulsion or addiction is. And obviously we can stop drinking alcohol, we can stop taking drugs, we don't actually need them. But what about the other addictions where, you know, we can't stop eating, we might be able to stop eating chocolate, but we can't stop eating food, it's sex, those kinds of addictions, which we can't rely on abstinence to help us. Scott, what's your take on that?
So my take on that is that it's kind of dangerous to use a word to apply a philosophy to everyone's life, because everybody's so vastly different and their traumas and their deficiency stories are different. And just to give you a heads up on this, it's kind of a caveat, working with somebody on sex addiction. And one of the things for him was a repression of his sexual desire. So what would happen is that he snuffed out all sexual desire and sexual urges, and even including masturbation. And he's given me permission to talk about this because he wants this message to be heard, I think, and I do too. So he was literally, he associated any sexual desire with something that's bad and wrong, so he snuffed it all out. And then he got a hold of a program that said you need to abstain from all sexual activity, including masturbation. So what that did was further repress the sexual desire. So he struggled painfully for years trying to abstain completely from all sexual activities and while still dealing with the trauma. Well, it did not work because he had tucked the trauma down in with the sexuality. So the trauma was so connected to the sexual urge that it was all tucked down. The trauma was not accessible until I started to invite him to masturbate, you know, and then come back to me, and then we'd work on what, and the masturbating was exactly what brought up the trauma and the deficiency stories. Literally the next day, all that stuff came up for us, and then we could work through it. And then he started to experience this freedom and lack of shame and lack of trauma. So it's just, you know, and it makes me think of this abstinence model is great in certain situations. I'm certainly with heroin addiction, I would not say go out and do some heroin and then let's come back and look at it. But you got to be really keenly aware of what's going on with the person, what kinds of stories and behaviors are wrapped around the addiction, because in some situations when you encourage abstinence, you're actually encouraging repression and you're actually keeping the trauma down. You know, if you want to experience shame around food, go eat, go binge, and it'll bring it up, and then be with somebody who can work through that stuff. Because if you, and I'm not suggesting I'm not suggesting any formula for anyone. I'm simply saying be careful. But to me, the freedom in recovery is not that I'm abstaining, because there's no real freedom simply in abstinence. But the freedom is that when I think about something, or even have the urge for something, the shame is gone from it and the trauma is gone from it. Therefore, it's just the urge. And it tends to be that when I'm at that place with something where the trauma and the fear and the shame and the aversion is gone of it, the compulsion itself is reduced. It's not even really a compulsion, it's just more like desire. And it's much more manageable then. So it's a complicated field, and I think we're in a space that likes to talk about all or nothing, you know, abstinence for everyone in every way. And I just think that you have to be careful when you're dealing with the underlying issues. Find out how it comes up for people.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. On a somewhat related topic, somebody mentioned in the chat room earlier, you know, not all addictions are equal. I mean, some addictions we're talking about are actually life-threatening, aren't they? So is there something that you'd say about the scale of concern, as it were, that, you know, working from the most dangerous addictions down the scale, as it were?
Are you asking me, Fiona?
Yeah, and then everybody else can chip in.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. I saw the question and I wasn't sure exactly where it was coming from. But yeah, I mean, we definitely see people who are very close to death, you know, heroin addiction or alcohol addiction, and literally they're on death's door, or they're damaging their bodies, you know, overdosing, not dying, but overdosing repeatedly, or even close to death right before they come into treatment. And so it seems like it's a really, really, like, the whole issue is very up. And it's like you've hit rock bottom and the suffering is very intense. And then there are definitely gradations of that, because we also see people who have been suffering in their addiction, but there's no real palpable consequences. So even though they might be slowly sort of killing the body with sugar or alcohol, the doctor still says, well, your liver's okay right now. And then so the mind may not reach a level of physical suffering yet. And also there might not be enough mental and emotional suffering to kind of push them into that readiness. And that's a question that comes up here, is that if I can just do this and I'm not really suffering a whole lot around it, do I have to get my answer is, well, you're not going to anyway. If you're having to ask that question, chances are you're not at the place where you're ready to look. And that goes back to the readiness questions. It's a complicated question. But yeah, I guess if I'm understanding the question right, certainly suffering can play a part in whether someone's open to look at something. Because just again, speaking of the person I was just working with, the repression, the sexuality, the trauma was so very intense for him. It was affecting every aspect of his life, that it was just no other thing to do than just to be completely open to look. Whereas if somebody else is out there meandering through life, kind of dealing and coping with the trauma, okay, they may or may not be to that level of openness around this. But I don't want to generalize, because I've seen people with addictions that are not life-threatening who seem totally open.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that from anybody else on the panel?
I think I'd just like to reiterate how unique every person's path is, and how for some people abstinence is or abstaining or some kind of form of that may be what is being called to for their system, so that their system can study what that activity or substance was covering up. So for me, for example, it was really useful to have a period of celibacy, so I could really study my deficiency stories with regard to being alone, being unlovable, not being good enough, and so forth and so on. When I didn't have at my disposal these strategies, I was left with me. and there was no escaping those parts of me that had wanted to be escaped from. So, there's so many different things going on for each person, and just to be really aware of that, for all of the participants, to know that everyone's journey is uniquely their own. And I'm sure that as you're listening, you're going to be like, yeah, that really makes sense to me. And that doesn't make sense to me. And that's going to, so be really curious of your own system and what's kind of going on. And we all have a sense, again, of what escape means for each one of us. What does allow us to escape from what doesn't want to be met, and just follow the resonance of that uniquely in your own way.
Lovely, thank you.